This is a talk based on a joint paper that I'm giving with a evolutionary ecologist called David Robenheimer at the Philosophy of Science Association in Pittsburgh in November. So it's very much work in progress, and we're still finishing the paper. Looking forward to presenting it in, as I say, in Pittsburgh in November. So looking forward to your feedback, and well, let me just start. That's the best thing. So you'll all be familiar with the very famous paper published in 1979 by Stephen Jay Gould and Richard Lewontin with the strange title, The Spandrels of San Marco and the Panglossian Paradigm, a Critique of the Adaptationist Program. We can forget the first bit of the title. Basically, the paper is a critique of the adaptationist program in biology. This paper grew out of the 1970s controversies about human sociobiology. So Gould and Lewontin were both very fierce critics of the attempt to explain human behavior in terms of natural selection and the maximization of fitness. And they came up with a number of very good slogans which have stuck with us in biology. So we've probably all heard evolutionary explanations criticized by calling them just so stories. And that's a phrase that was introduced by Stephen Jay Gould in a 1978 paper. And strangely enough, even though the word spandrel is a rather obscure technical term from the history of architecture, it's now a word that most biologists have heard. Spandrels as side effects of evolution which have no real adaptive value in their own right. Strange word, but they've managed to get these words and these slogans very widely understood. But the actual content of the argument, what is adaptationism and why is it meant to be a bad thing, has always been much more complicated. There's quite a lot of different papers in philosophy discussing what adaptationism is and what Gould and Lewontin meant by adaptationism. What I want to do today is to take the most common mainstream definitions of adaptationism and suggest that they're not very helpful. So here's a good way to get a mainstream definition: to go to the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy, which is the most widely used reference work in our field. We all know that. And two very eminent people, Steve Orszak, the population geneticist, and Patrick Forber, the philosopher, quote, "Advocates of adaptationism, or adaptationists, view natural selection among individuals within a population as the only important cause of the evolution of a trait." So according to these guys, the adaptationism is a view about there only being one important cause, namely natural selection. Here's a well-known paper on evolutionary medicine by another well-known philosopher of medicine, Sean Valles. And he says, quote, "Adaptationism," which he then defines, "the empirical assumption that non-adaptive evolutionary processes are causally unimportant compared to natural selection." So this is perhaps the best known way of thinking about adaptationism, that adaptationism is one view on the relative importance of different competing causes. And anti-adaptationism is the opposite view, that those causes are less important and the other causes are more important. So it's about, of the different causes of evolutionary change, which ones carry the most weight or do the most work. What I want to argue in this paper is that this whole idea that there's something called natural selection and there's something separate from it called non-adaptive evolutionary processes, and that these are competing causes, so that if one explains more about evolution, the other one explains less about evolution, is a mistake. That we need to rethink adaptationism completely And while we might recognize that Gould and Lewontin described some not very good biological reasoning and some better biological reasoning, and we might want to call the not very good biological reasoning adaptationist, and we might want to call the better biological reasoning non-adaptationist or sophisticated adaptationism or something like that, we can't make that distinction by contrasting things that are caused by natural selection with things that are caused by other non-adaptive evolutionary processes. These two things just aren't in competition with one another. So that's what I want to argue. So the most famous paper trying to analyze this idea of adaptationism is by Peter Godfrey Smith, published 20 years ago. If he describes 3 types of adaptationism, and if you find that too simple, you can read a paper by Tim Lewins at the University of Cambridge who claims there are 7 types of adaptationism. But these are just 2 of many papers that try to analyze adaptationism, distinguish different things that people mean by that word in different occasions and pull them apart. It's useful to go through Peter Godfrey Smith's 3 kinds of adaptationism because it is an accurate description of the literature that he's talking about. And it does show you that there are very different things going on. But ultimately, I'm going to argue that these definitions of adaptationism are not particularly helpful. So first of all, Godfrey Smith describes empirical adaptationism. And empirical adaptationism is meant to be a straightforward empirical claim, a claim about how biology is, what the facts are like. It's the claim that many or most phenotypes are adaptively optimal. And what does that mean? Well, the most rigorous and careful attempt to analyze that is due to Steve Orszag and Elliot Sober, who invented this idea of a censored model. So they say that the optimal phenotype is the phenotype predicted by, quote, a censored model, i.e., a model in which the only evolutionary force is natural selection. So the idea that Orszag and Sober have is you build a model of the evolution of a phenotype, and the model will contain the relative fitnesses of the competing traits, and it will contain mutation pressure at the various genes affecting those traits. It will contain a factor for genetic drift. And then you could also build into the model things like the range of alternative phenotypes, some of which are easy to access and some of which are hard to access. And then the idea is that you start taking things out of the model, censoring the model. So first of all, you remove genetic drift, and that doesn't make any difference. Then you remove the constraints on the accessibility of phenotypes, and that doesn't make any difference. And then perhaps you remove the genetic architecture, and you just say that everything is produced by a single locus. Each trait you're interested in just depends on a single locus. So you make the model simpler and simpler. You take away everything apart from the relative fitnesses of the competing types in the population. And if that doesn't make very much difference to your ability to predict the actual or observed phenotype, the actual phenotype, then that phenotype is adaptively optimal, and adaptationism has been vindicated in the particular case that you're studying. What I want to argue in this paper is that that idea doesn't make much sense when you look at real adaptationist models of the evolution of phenotypes. But it's a very widely accepted view that empirical adaptationism as a factual claim about the biological world, is the claim that if you take everything other than the relative fitnesses of the competing traits out of the model, you still have a reasonable model. It may not be perfect, but it's still pretty good at predicting what you will observe in nature. The second category that Godfrey Smith introduces is methodological adaptationism, and I think his treatment is very much based on the ideas of the great evolutionary biologist John Maynard Smith. And in a number of publications, John Maynard Smith pushed back against people like Gould and Lewontin by saying, even if you think that organisms are not adaptively optimal, the best way to do biology is to find out what would be adaptively optimal. And then when your models fail to predict reality, that will reveal the other factors in evolution. So the idea is that Maynard Smith was trying to remain neutral on empirical adaptationism. I don't know whether empirical adaptationism is true or not, but whether it's true or not, the best way to find the truth is to build adaptationist models to find out what is adaptively optimal. So if adaptation is true, those models will predict the truth. If adaptationism is false, the way in which those models will fail will reveal what are the other factors in evolution and how important are they. So methodological adaptationism says whether or not empirical adaptationism is true, we should continue to do the same kind of science. We should build models that try to discover what is or would be adaptively optimal. And the third and strangest category that Peter Godfrey Smith comes up with is explanatory adaptationism. And reading Peter's paper, it's slightly puzzling. What is explanatory adaptationism? He makes it sound sometimes as if it's a kind of a matter of what biologists are interested in, or the sort of psychology of biologists. So explanatory adaptationism is the view that explaining why organisms are adapted to their environment has some sort of explanatory priority over other biological questions. And in his paper, Peter Godfrey Smith quotes the biologist Richard Dawkins as an example of explanatory adaptationism. And in that quotation, Dawkins says, well, constraints might be really important, but they're only important in the boring parts of biology. The exciting parts of biology are where we understand why organisms are well adapted. So it's saying, again, what Dawkins is saying there is, even if empirical adaptationism is false, the most important, the most interesting parts of biology will be where empirical adaptationism is reasonably accurate or reasonably true. And the other bits are less interesting. Where it fails, that kind of shows that the biology isn't as interesting. So it's a very strange thing, explanatory adaptationism. And at the end of this paper, I'll come back to, in my new way of thinking about adaptationism, maybe explanatory adaptationism makes more sense and is a more straightforward idea. So this three-part taxonomy I've just presented, it's widely used. Many people have found it a useful framework for trying to pull the adaptationism apart into different, reasonably well-defined questions. But instead of this three-part taxonomy, I want to introduce a two-part taxonomy, so to make things simpler. And I want to contrast two ways of thinking about adaptation itself. The first one is the idea of adaptation as engineering. So the idea of adaptation as engineering is that biological traits are shaped by evolution to serve one or more purposes that can be specified in advance of understanding the evolution of those traits. And that hopefully will remind some of you of the simple idea of adaptive function that I was criticizing yesterday. So I'm calling it adaptation as engineering because it makes evolutionary adaptation more like normal human design, the design of an artifact. So if we want to make a good chair, we know what a chair is for, roughly. We know the kinds of things chairs are going to be used for. And so an adaptationist view on chairs would say chairs are well designed for sitting on. Now, as I don't know what it's like for you, but here in Australia, far too many chairs are designed to look good rather than to be comfortable to sit in. So we might be anti-adaptationists about the design of chairs. We might want to say chairs are not well engineered. They're very badly engineered because people are too concerned about making them pretty or fashionable or cheap, and they're not sufficiently concerned with making them good to sit on. So adaptation as engineering is that kind of thinking applied to biological traits. We can specify in advance what is the problem the trait is meant to solve, and we can ask, is it well designed? Is it well designed to solve the problem? And I want to contrast that to the idea of adaptation as evolution, where adaptation, as I described in a couple of examples yesterday, is a dynamical process in which the optimal phenotype often changes as the population responds to selection. So the evolution of the population is changing the problem as it evolves. The environments, which we sometimes think of as posing the problem, and this is an idea that Gould and Lewontin said, adaptationists believe that the environment sets a fixed or a set problem to be solved, and they said that's not true, but that's fine. So we recognize that environments have a statistical and spatial structure. So there isn't an environment, but rather there's a complex, statistically and spatially structured environment that organisms have to deal with. And I'll give an example in a moment. And organisms can change in response to the evolution of the population, partly because the population itself is an environment for every individual in the population, but not only for that reason. So we're not just talking about frequency-dependent selection, you're also talking about niche construction. And niche construction, as you probably know, means several different things. A lot of different processes there. And also, organisms themselves are not, one of the things that Gould and Lewontin criticized about the adaptationist program is the idea that each part of an organism is optimized separately. But in what I'm calling adaptation as evolution, we recognize that organisms are complex bundles of trade-offs. So the unit of evolutionary analysis is typically not an individual trait, but one or more trade-off matrices. So what's being optimized is the pattern in which different traits trade off against one another. Improving one makes another one worse in a multidimensional kind of way. What I'm going to show you is that this is what real adaptive evolutionary models often look like. So with adaptation as evolution, we're thinking of adaptation as a process in which the problem is continually being redefined by the process of evolution, in which the problem is not constant, but posed by a complex environment, an environment that's always changing, and in which organisms are simultaneously trying to solve lots of different adaptive problems, which are all tangled up with one another. Now, while you can describe adaptation and evolution in an incredibly extended sense as engineering a solution to a problem, that's a very misleading metaphor. It pushes into the background the big differences between real evolutionary adaptation as we understand it in our best models and human engineering, typical examples of engineered solutions to problems. So I don't think there is a kind of ultimate metaphysical distinction between what I've called adaptation as engineering and adaptation as evolution. What I think is that adaptation as engineering is a very limited special case, sometimes with very simple problems, with fixed fitness functions. I think my favorite example of a real case of evolutionary adaptation that fits the model of adaptation as engineering is the aerodynamics of the wings of birds. Now, it doesn't fit perfectly because there's a feedback loop that isn't there in human engineering, but you can reasonably think about the evolution of the shape of the wing of a bird as something like the way in which we engineer wings. If you know what kind of flight characteristics you want the bird or the machine to have, you can use aerodynamics to design a wing that has those flight characteristics. And if you are, for example, an albatross, and what you want to do is to fly for an entire year without touching the ground while using as little energy as possible, then the optimal solution to that problem doesn't really depend on what the other albatrosses are doing. And your solution to that problem is going to work pretty much everywhere in the South Pole. There aren't different places around the world or different times of the year when the air is different. Okay, the conditions you're dealing with are pretty much the same. So more or less, you can treat a problem like that as adaptation as engineering. But if we look at adaptation in general, a lot of evolution is incredibly different from engineering. And so it's really misleading to describe evolution as engineering a solution to a problem. Okay, you're stretching that metaphor to its absolute limits. Okay, so if we have two ways of thinking about adaptation, we also have two ways of thinking about adaptationism. So now we can split the definition of adaptation, definition of adaptationism into two kinds. So engineering adaptationism would be the view that biological traits are designed to serve one or more purposes that can be specified in advance of understanding the evolution of those traits. That you can describe, so adaptationism is the view that when you look at a biological trait, it will be a good design to solve a problem. Whereas evolutionary adaptationism is something very different. It's the claim that the observed values of biological traits can be explained by our best current models of natural selection. Okay, so engineering adaptationism gives you describes a problem and claims that traits are good solutions to those problems. Evolutionary adaptationism focuses on the process of adaptation. And it just says what you'll see is what you could predict using our best current models of natural selection. So I'll cash that out with a couple of examples. First, a very simple example, something called cliff edge fitness functions that some of you will probably have heard about because they've been making a bit of a splash in evolutionary psychology recently. Perhaps I should say evolutionary psychiatry. Anyway, so let's look at the diagram on the right. It's very simple. The idea is that we have a trait. The classic example for explaining this is the length and thinness of the legs of a racehorse. So we're breeding racehorses, and the longer and thinner their legs are, the faster they can run. So now we can set the engineering problem of building the best possible racehorse. And the best possible racehorse is going to be represented by that red dot at the peak of the curve up here. It's the best possible racehorse because it will be the most biologically fit. In the case of racehorses, you get to be fit because the horse breeder gives you the most mares to mate with. The way to be a very biologically fit racehorse is to be picked for breeding the next generation of racehorses. Basically, as I understand it, in the biology of racehorses, if you're a male racehorse, your biological fitness is either incredibly high or zero. Okay, so that's the engineering optimum design, the red dot. However, the nature of biological development means that any given genotype will produce a normal distribution around itself. So some of your offspring have legs that are slightly thicker and shorter than yours, and some will have legs that are even longer and even thinner than yours. The point about a cliff edge fitness function is that fitness goes up and up and up and up and up, and then drops off a cliff. In the case of racehorses, it drops off a cliff because just beyond the optimal value where you run as fast as possible, your legs break. You enter the race, you get halfway around the course, and your leg breaks. So what that means is that if you look at the organism which has the most grandchildren or great-grandchildren, it's going to be actually slightly below the optimum, because the number of individuals under the blue curve which do well is slightly larger than the number of individuals under the red curve that do well. The trouble with the red genotype is that too many of your offspring fall off the cliff. What's so good about the blue genotype is that while you yourself are slightly less optimal, less of your offspring fall off the cliff. So in the long term, over many generations, you'll leave more offspring. Now, it's slightly artificial to do this with racehorses because it's artificial selection, but imagine a natural population where you've got cliff edge fitness functions, and view is that there ought to be quite a lot of cliff edge fitness functions. Some people have argued that the design of the human brain has a cliff edge fitness function to it. That's one reason why people are so interested in this. Okay, now, if we use the engineering conception of adaptationism, the phenomena of cliff-edged fitness functions seems to refute adaptationism. The organisms which actually evolve, the blue organisms, are less perfectly designed than the optimal red organism because of a developmental constraint, which is the inability to eliminate variation in development. The fact that your offspring are a normal distribution around your median trait value. On the other hand, if we use the evolutionary conception of adaptationism, this model looks like an absolutely straightforward example of using adaptationist reasoning to explain biological form. It's a model that just thinks about how to maximize your fitness. You might say, oh, because it includes genetic architecture, it's less adaptationist. And other than, I guess my only response to that is, I can't imagine a biologist being more adaptationist than the guys putting forward this model. They're thinking about natural selection all the time. Natural selection is what obsesses them. So the idea that you would be a better adaptationist, you'd be more of an adaptationist is somebody who thinks this model shouldn't be true, just strikes me as very strange. There's something's wrong with this way of thinking about adaptation. And I think we can explain what's wrong with it more better by looking at a different example, a slightly more complicated example. Okay, this looks complicated, but I'll try and make it simple. So this is my collaborator, David Robenheimer's work. And he works on building evolutionary models of why organisms eat the combinations of foods that they choose to eat. So on the left of this diagram is the left-hand picture shows a space with two axes. On the horizontal axis is the amount of protein energy, so the absolute quantity of protein energy that an organism consumes in a fixed period. And on the vertical axis is the absolute amount of carbohydrate energy that the organism consumes in the same period. The two little red crosses are just the actual the actual intake of two individual organisms. So we don't need to worry about that very much. The colored areas are estimates of the ratio of carbohydrate to protein, which gives you the best result with respect to a given phenotype. So the brown area at the top shows you the combination of carbohydrate and protein energy, which you should consume in order to be as fat as possible. Okay, so that's adiposity, fatness. How much fat your body is going to contain. The purple area labeled reproductive functioning is the combination of carbohydrate and protein you ought to consume in order to maximize your lifetime reproductive output. And these are, by the way, are all things you can measure in mice and rats and so forth. You can do this experimentally. The light brown area in the bottom left is the region which maximizes cardiometabolic and immune functioning. So the fact that those two areas are different is an example of the well-known phenomena that reproductive fitness trades off against condition. So the diet which gives you the best health isn't the best sort of physical state, is not the diet that gives you maximum reproductive output. And the two little blue areas at the top left are really interesting. They are the optimal diet in order to maximize life expectancy at birth, and the optimal diet to maximize life expectancy at a later point in your life cycle. So it turns out that the diet which you should eat at birth, the diet which maximizes your life expectancy at birth is not the same as the diet that maximizes your life expectancy at a later age. So now I'm 30, what should I eat now to maximize my life expectancy? Okay, so what we're doing here is we're measuring which combinations of different macronutrients, major ingredients. You can increase the number of dimensions in this model to include other nutrients, but it's simplest to do it with two. And the black dot is meant to indicate, this is a theoretical model, okay? The black dot and the region around it is meant to indicate, given that the organism has to trade off many different things it's trying to do, it's trying to remain in good physical condition, it's trying to invest in offspring, and it's trying to extend its lifespan, and of course, numerous other things. But the black dot is an intake target which represents a good trade-off between all the different things that an organism needs to achieve over its life. Okay, so that's maximizing its evolutionary fitness. So if you were to be over here in the purple area, you'd be really good at having children, but you'd probably be dead next year. If you were over here in the brown area, you'd be in very good physical health, but you wouldn't be having lots of babies. So you want to be somewhere in the middle. That's roughly the idea. Okay, so let's look at the right-hand graph. The right-hand graph is an attempt to explain why in some environments organisms eat far too many calories, why they eat more food than they need for their energy consumption and increase in weight. So it's a very useful model, actually. There's a whole kind of field using these models, but this is just one simple theoretical example. So we do the same thing. We graph, in this case, carbohydrate and fat combined on the vertical axis and protein on the horizontal axis. So these are called rails. Every vector in this space defines a ratio of carbohydrate to protein. So you've got a ratio. If we take this, the dark line, the solid line, the ratio is 14% carbohydrate to protein. But as you move up the line, the absolute quantity of carbohydrate and protein increases. And if we go to this bottom dotted line here, that's also a constant ratio, but it's as you go up, you're consuming more carbohydrate and more protein, but you're consuming proportionally more protein to carbohydrate all the way up the line. Okay, so the combinations of foods that are available in your environment constrain where you can be in this space. A very simple example from the scientific literature is that there are some primates which eat both leaves and fruit. When the plants they live on are not producing fruit, they have to eat only leaves. and leaves have a very high protein content. And if the only thing you can eat in is leaves, it's very hard to get onto the left-hand side of this graph, to get up here. You're stuck down here because the only foods available to you have a high protein content. That's a real example from the scientific literature. What this graph shows you is that if the available foods constrain an organism to being on one of these high carbohydrate vectors here, if it's not possible for an organism to find foods with enough protein in them, and if they're trying to consume an absolute quantity of protein, so they're trying to eat a certain number of grams of protein in a given unit time, they'll have to enormously increase the amount of carbohydrate that they consume in order to hit their protein intake target. So this is called the protein leverage effect. It's the idea that on a very low protein diet, if organisms are trying to hit an absolute protein intake target, they will consume far more calories than they need and put on a lot of weight. And there's a lot of evidence in humans that humans target a constant quantity of protein per day, that our appetite is driven by a fairly rigid protein intake target. So this is an attempt to explain why changing to a modern high carbohydrate diet can produce high levels of obesity in places with those kinds of foodstuffs, the protein leverage effect. Now, what's interesting here is not the details of the science, which I'm giving a very rough and ready picture of. What's interesting is that these are people building evolutionary models of why organisms eat the things that they do eat. Okay? So in fact, this is, I think, probably the best current evolutionary science about optimal diet. So what we want to do now is look at, in these nutritional geometry models, what's going on with adaptationism and adaptive reasoning. The first general point I want to make is that the geometric model would not become less adaptationist if we remove the constraints. So let's just go back to the two kinds of constraints. There are two kinds of constraints. There are internal constraints. The organism is a complex system in which different parts of it are linked together, and many different problems need to be solved, but you can only eat one diet. So what we're looking at in that left-hand diagram are effectively the constraints on adaptation posed by the integration of the organism. What I'm trying to get at is, what we're looking at here is, some of the most famous apparatus in modern evolutionary theory. It's basically life history theory, and the idea that the basic problem facing an organism is resource allocation to competing goals. It's all about optimization. I mean, I can't think of a more straightforward example of Darwinian evolution by natural selection than life history theory. If we were to take this out, not think about these trade-offs, the idea that that would make us less adaptationist or less interested in natural selection just makes no sense to me at all. Then there are the environmental constraints. The environmental constraints are the available foods. So the foods that are available constrain where the organism can go in nutritional space. And the evolution of the organism has to take that into account. So if we go back to the model, what's this diagram helps you to show the constraints on the organism's behavior imposed by the environment. And then a lot of the work in this field is how organisms evolve to develop their response to those constraints. So in humans, the argument is, it makes sense for humans to have an absolute protein intake target, because in human history, the idea of easily available high energy diets with no protein in them is something that just didn't occur. You know, there are, until very recently, there have not been very many human communities where you could have as much sugar as you wanted, but it was almost impossible to get meat. Okay, that's not a problem we had to deal with. On the other hand, there's some very lovely evidence that shows that the metabolism of human populations which have had a long period of association with successful agriculture. They've lived for thousands of years with relatively successful agricultural economies with relatively few famines, have actually adapted their metabolism to a higher carbohydrate content of the diet. So you can actually see adaptive tracking of metabolism and intake targets based on the constraints that the environment poses on where you can be in that space. Okay. So again, if you were to take those, the idea that you would be less interested in natural selection if you were less interested in how organisms evolve to deal with environmental change in their diet is just bizarre. Okay. Another point I want to make about those models is that in the classic discussion of adaptation in the adaptationism in the philosophical literature, it's always assumed that the optimal phenotype is predicted by the model. But in fact, in these models, the optimal phenotype is often something that you establish experimentally. So, for example, you give an organism an absolutely unconstrained environment in which it can assemble whatever diet it wants, and you find the protein intake target of the organism empirically, and then you try to explain why the organism is aiming for that target. Okay, so you can actually, and again over here, you can experimentally find the optimal phenotype for cardiometabolic functioning. You can just basically put your mice on different diets and find which diet maximizes that parameter. Or you can put your mice on different diets and find which have the most babies that season. You can put your mice on different diets and you can measure their life expectancies or their adiposity. So these targets, which are what we think, so in this case, this is the optimum protein intake, are things that we can actually establish experimentally. And another thing, the main function of identifying the optimal nutritional intake is not to predict that we will observe organisms reaching the optima. One of the main things that these models try to explain is how do organisms cope when they can't reach the optimal phenotype? They can't consume the optimal diet. What is their second best strategy that they follow and why? So, for example, I've said that humans target an absolute seem to target an absolute protein intake target, which means that when they're constrained to a high carbohydrate environment, they overconsume carbohydrates. But not all species do that. Other species will basically sacrifice some of their protein intake in order not to go too high on the carbohydrates, or vice versa. Different species have different rules of compromise for dealing with constrained environments where they can't achieve the optimal phenotype. So again, the optima is not, it's not that we build a model, predict what the perfect organism is, and then go and observe it. Instead, we build a model that reveals what would be best for an organism, but also why the organism can't have that. But in the light of the model, what would be its next best option? What can it do given the trade-offs and the constraints? So adaptation in these kind of models is essentially optimization within constraints. If you take the constraints out, you don't have a more Darwinian or a more adaptationist model. You just don't have a model. You're throwing out the whole problem that you're trying to solve. Okay, so what I'm trying to get at is that these models, which to me, and this is just I guess an observation, seem to be powerful examples of 100% adaptationist reasoning by biologists who are fundamentally concerned with natural selection and how does it work and what is the best design of the phenotype, seems to fit more with what I called the evolutionary notion of adaptation than with the engineering notion of adaptation. So I want to rethink this very idea of constraints. So in the philosophical literature, adaptation and constraint are regularly set up as if they're competing explanations. So constraints are normally described as arising from genetic and developmental architecture, and they stop the organism reaching its optima. They're constraints on adaptation, as Ron Amundsen has called them. And in this excellent 1994 paper, Amundsen points out that in many areas of biology, there are concepts of constraint which aren't in competition with adaptation. He's talking about some rather different areas of biology, but it's a very good point. So what I would say is that in the models I've just described, the internal and external constraints define the adaptive problem. So instead of thinking of constraints as competing with adaptation, you should think of the constraints as the boundary conditions on the adaptive process. They define the problem which adaptation is attacking. And yeah, I've already said that last bit. So the whole idea of the more natural selection you have, the less constraints you have, is, in my view, just not making much sense when you look at these actual models of the evolution of phenotypes. So let's rethink adaptationism. Empirical adaptationism, remember, is meant to be the claim that selection is the only important cause of form. And in the Orszag and Sober formulation, it's the claim that phenotypes can be predicted equally well when factors other than relative fitnesses are deleted from the model, when you take out constraints and drift and mutation pressure and so forth. But that's clearly not true in the models just described. In the discovery phase, when we're building the model, the research is guided at every stage by the assumption that organisms are seeking to maximize their fitness, but of course, in the light of constraints and trade-offs. And that's not a concession. The whole idea of organisms maximizing their fitness is framed as fitness is a trade-off, and the problem of maximizing fitness is the problem of operating within the constraints. It's there from the very beginning. And in the explanatory stage, when you've built and tested and you have a successful model, phenotypes are explained as the result of evolution by natural selection as it plays out in a model which postulates specific constraints and trade-offs. If you take away the constraints and trade-offs, you just don't have a model. So I think we can redefine adaptation in relation to our evolutionary notion of adaptation. So we can reject an engineering definition of adaptationism, where the adaptationist is somebody who thinks that traits are designed to serve one or more purposes that can be specified in advance of understanding their evolution. And we can replace that with the idea of evolutionary adaptationism, which is the idea that the observed values of biological traits can be explained by our best current models of natural selection. Now, in the literature, people often use this phrase naive adaptationism. And I think quite a useful way to think about it is that naive adaptationism, when you look at the examples of bad adaptationist reasoning that people hold up and say, that's naive adaptationism, it's what they're criticizing seems to be the assumption that the engineering model of adaptation is generally applicable instead of being a very special case. Okay, so you could say there's something bad, naive adaptationism, and that's thinking that the engineering model of adaptation is widely applicable. It's often correct, when in fact it's rarely correct. It's a special case. But I think the best way to think about adaptationism is the second way, and the adaptationism that I'm interested in is not naive adaptationism, but this evolutionary adaptationism. And this sorry, is somebody?
No.
Yeah, okay. No, it's all right, good. So I said at the beginning of the talk that at the end of the talk, I would be able to make more sense of explanatory adaptationism. Remember, I said explanatory adaptationism is the idea that adaptationism is not an empirical claim about the world, but a claim about it's the central task of biology to explain adaptation, or adaptation is the most important question. If we redefine adaptationism in the way that I've suggested, where adaptationism is the claim that traits take the values which are explained by the process of adaptation by natural selection, then explanatory adaptationism becomes the idea that a central task of biology is to explain how the traits we observe are consistent with our best current models of natural selection. And in that case, explanatory adaptationism is just the straightforward, old scientific imperative to make observation consistent with theory. Here's our best current model of evolution. Of course, it's a central problem to show that the traits we observe are consistent with our best current model, simply because we need to make observation consistent with theory. So on this way of thinking about adaptation, the fact that biologists seem to be more interested in adaptation than anything else, that they take explaining adaptation to be the big problem, starts to make a bit more sense. Okay, and that's it. There's a nice picture of my research center. Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Okay, sorry. We are taking questions, and first from the room, and then from online audience. So if you have any questions, you can just raise your hand on Zoom or chat, type in the chat box. So I will ask the first question. So when you're saying the evolutionary adaptationism defined by your theory is rather to explain what has been observed rather than to predict. I was a little confused because is that undermining what a theory, scientific theory can do? Understanding of scientific theory, a theory should have some predictive power. And if you just say it's not the aim or the goal is not to predict rather than to just explain what has been observed, then is it another kind which makes the evolutionary explanation another kind of just so story, like it's just a story to explain what has happened, but it does not have the predictive power.
Yeah, I didn't mean to say anything as straightforward about just being about explanation. I mean, these models predict what the organism will do when you change their diet. My point was just that the optimal phenotype, they don't predict that the organism will have the optimal phenotype. They make lots of predictions about what the organism will do. They predict, for example, that if you change the diet, the organism will get fat or whatever, right? But so the contrast was just with respect to in the classic discussions of adaptation in the literature, the idea is that you build the model, it predicts what is the optimal phenotype. And if you don't observe the optimal phenotype, then that's a problem for your model. Whereas in the models that I described, you predict lots of things, but you don't generally, I mean, you predict that if you remove all of the constraints, the organism will seek the optimal phenotype. Okay, but actually you don't expect to see that very often. A lot of the time you expect to see the organism doing things that are really suboptimal because that's the best option. So the way that people often write in this literature is about the organism's primary target, which it can never reach, its secondary target, which it's trying to reach but can't always reach, and then the tertiary target, which is where it will try to go if it can't reach the secondary target. So that's a kind of classic formulation. So the human being that's eating far too much carbohydrate is hitting its secondary target. That's roughly the idea.
Right. Thank you. Yeah, that makes very much sense. And we have Zhang Mingjun again in the chat box. Mingjun, could you just open your, yeah.
Yeah, thanks for the talk. My question is in the chat box, like, could you help me like understand how your reformulation of adaptationism is different from previous formulations, especially the empirical adaptationism? Like, because I feel that like people like Alice Sauber or Peter Goldfried-Smith, they would say that, oh, I agree with what you said, like it's not that much different from what we have said about what empirical adaptationism should be like.
Yeah, it's a good question, because in some ways what I fundamentally disagree with Peter Goldfried-Smith and Orszag and Sober about is not really whether their definition is right or wrong, but whether their definition is a useful way of understanding what biologists are actually doing in adaptationist reasoning. So the way they set it up, if in the Orszag and Sober paper where they introduced the idea of censored models, they try to draw a distinction between global constraints and local constraints. Mm-hmm. And it's a very subtle distinction. I'm not sure that it really is clear. And they say, I mean, everybody knows that there are no adaptationist models with no constraints. There's a famous joke by John Maynard Smith, who said, if there were no constraints on adaptation, organisms would fly infinitely fast, have infinitely many eggs every year, and be armed with machine guns. Okay. That's, obviously adaptation is constrained. Organisms can't just do whatever they want in evolution. So on the other hand, if you, I forget who made this joke, but it was another famous biologist who said, everything is optimal when you understand all the constraints.
Right.
Now, so whatever happens is best when you understand all the problems. Okay. Now, the way that Goldfried-Smith and Orszag and Sober contrast adaptationist reasoning with, anti-adaptationist reasoning or correct reasoning assumes that you can draw a line between the constraints that you're allowed to have in your model and still be an adaptationist, and the constraints that you're not allowed to have. So that's what, so in Orszag and Sober, the global constraints are the ones that the adaptationist is allowed to have, but the local constraints are the ones that if the adaptationist uses those, they're admitting that adaptationism isn't as true as they thought it was. That's kind of moving away from adaptationism. I don't think you can really draw a distinction between global and local constraints. I think that in one of the problems with Orszag and Sober is that they're thinking about very abstract models in population genetics. And in an abstract model in population genetics, it makes sense to talk about, let's take mutation pressure out of the model, or let's move to an infinite population size. And you still have, in some sense, a meaningful model, right? Whereas the kinds of rich models of the evolution of actual phenotypes that I've been describing, which I would claim are, when we talk about adaptationist reasoning in biology, we're normally talking about specific phenotypes in real organisms, and we're trying to explain why they are the way they are, right? And when you look at those actual empirically rich models of the evolution of specific phenotypes, the constraints, the relationship between constraints and natural selection is not such that you can take the constraints away and still have the same process of natural selection. When you take the constraints away, you destroy the model. So what I think happened is that Goldfried-Smith and Orszag and Sober have set up a definition which, when you look at a very abstract population genetic model, you can apply the definition and it makes sense. When you apply it to these richer empirical models, which I would argue are really what we're talking about when we talk about adaptationist reasoning, their definition isn't useful because it suggests that, well, basically you end up with no adaptationists anymore. Okay, because an adaptationist is meant to take everything away apart from relative fitness values, and then you just don't have a model. Okay, the more you take, all you're doing is basically, you're not actually taking something out of the same model, you're actually moving to a different model and eventually to no model at all, right?
Yeah.
So
for
example, with the evolution, with the cliff edge fitness model, if you draw the cliff edge fitness function model and say that we're going to take developmental biology out of the model, you don't have a simplified model. You just don't have the phenomena you were talking about in the first place. So if you say, we're going to build a cliff edge fitness function model, but we're going to have no difference between genotypes and phenotypes, then you just don't have a model. So I guess what I'm saying is it's not that Godfrey Smith's definition is wrong. It's that it can't be applied to what I think are the cases we want to understand, which are proper, detailed evolutionary models of why a particular organism has a particular phenotype. And since the definition can't be applied, it's not a useful definition, and we need a different definition.
So I think my question is like this. So for Solver and Godfrey Smith, at least they can make a distinction between adaptationism and anti-adaptationism. But according to your reformulation, what is the difference between an adaptationist and an anti-adaptationist, according to your reformulation?
Yeah. So one of the things I'm trying to argue is that the debate of adaptationism versus anti-adaptationism is actually a bit silly. It could be expressed as simply as there are people doing good model building and people doing bad model building. And that's not a philosophically interesting distinction.
Yeah. But
so the idea that there are two kinds of biology, as opposed to there are just people who are doing bad work, that's not very philosophically interesting.
Yeah, I agree. But in the last slide, you said that you want to reformulate adaptationism. Like, why don't you just say that I don't want to talk about adaptationism at all? Because that term, it just doesn't help. Like, you still want to talk about the term how adaptation is, and you want to reformulate it. But if what you just said is your real idea, then what you really want to say is that, oh, I'm not reformulating adaptation. I want to throw out this term adaptation. I want to talk about how to build a good model, evolutionary good model. Like, that's my kind of a confusion after hearing your response to my question.
Yeah, I think that's a very, very helpful comment, Ming-Jun. I mean, so yes, you could express my view as we should throw away the adaptationism debate. The only reason I'm keeping it is I do want to contrast, as I was doing in my talk yesterday, a engineering conception of adaptation with an evolutionary conception of adaptation. And ultimately, I think the engineering conception is a very limited special case. And when I read the old adaptationist literature, one thing I find is people who are criticizing. So, for example, it's such a complicated, when you go back and read and several philosophers have said this, when you go back and read the Gould and Lewontin paper, there are several different topics in biology that they're discussing. Okay, so sometimes they're discussing the relation between evolution and development. Sometimes they're discussing kind of stochasticity and drift. Sometimes they're discussing, the sort of issues I was talking about today. There's a lot going on in the adaptationism debate. I think one thing that's going on in the adaptationism debate is people are you're identifying cases where you need to think about evolution in a more sophisticated and dynamic way, as I described, and you're criticizing people for treating it as if it was just solving a fixed engineering problem. So a lot of Lewontin's specific cases where he criticizes adaptationist reasoning, look as if what he's actually saying is stop thinking about it as a fixed, simple problem and recognize it as a dynamic problem where, the environment's changing and fitness functions are changing. So in some sense, and I guess yeah, so I think this is very helpful because the way I'm doing it at the moment, there are probably at least two different things that I'm trying to say in this paper. So one is this contrast between engineering and adaptation, and the other one is that the adaptationism versus anti-adaptationism is a distinction that I pretty much reject. And it would be good to distinguish those two, and yeah, so I could certainly state what I'm trying to say more clearly. So thank you for that very helpful question.
Thanks so much.
I have a follow-up because when Mingjun asked his question, my initial thinking that you would give the answer would be adaptationism should be related, or any version of adaptationism should always relate to optimal models. So if you stick to the optimal model as the task for evolutionary biology, then of course it's adaptationism. And when I read the Spangel paper, there Gold and Lewontin are suggesting that we should have a new paradigm that which really puts the constraints as the constitute parts of a theory, rather than just to treat it as ad hoc addings. But I was thinking that you just have done both, like you remain or save the optimal model, as well as to make the constraints into the model. So this is a just comment, and I think Mingjun's question can give a better answer, because I think you can just remain the adaptationism notion because the optimal thing.
I think one of the really complicated issues, Chae-Ying, is that when we as philosophers start talking about biology, we pick out certain examples and then, give them a name, and then those examples might not be. So when Gould and Lewontin were writing, they were talking about the classic optimality modeling tradition in behavioral ecology in the period of the 1970s and early 80s, and perhaps back into the 60s if you're lucky. So they're looking at a particular tradition of modeling, which in fact is quite an abstract tradition. So it's the sort of thing that shows up in, so I see somebody asked the question about dynamic game theories. So, John Maynard Smith's Evolution and Theory of Games contains some of those early models. And they were particularly targeting things like optimal foraging theory, which have built generic models and made generic predictions. Okay, so on the other hand, this paper was driven by examining, specific models built by the scientists that I work with. And what struck me was that when you look at these models, they're obsessed with optimality. Optima, these targets are the currency they deal. Everybody's trying to measure and characterize optima all the time. But these models are quite different from those generic optimality, generic foraging models from the 1980s. So, I've started using this phrase, sort of optimality-based reasoning, as opposed to optimality modeling, to show that I'm not talking about those specific models, from the 80s and so forth, right? And again, when we look at life history theory, early life history theory models, the very general ones you're talking about, sort of, in Stephen Stern's famous 1992 book, you might well be able to apply some of the Orszag and Sober definitions to those. But you look at modern life history theory, what's called state-dependent life history theory, where the organism is seen as a dynamic system what is optimal for the organism is changing over its lifetime as a function of the change in the organism's phenotype, right? And you start to get models, whereas I think they look much more like the nutritional geometry models that I've just been talking about. So another way to sort of read this paper is basically to say, here are some examples of what clearly looks like really good science. It's science done by people who are fanatical Darwinists who are obsessed with natural selection. So saying they're not adaptationists doesn't make any sense. And yet the way you're talking about adaptationism doesn't fit here. So we need, if we're going to go on having a philosophy of adaptive evolutionary reasoning, then we need some new categories and new ideas about adaptation. The ideas that were developed, back in the 1980s, well, basically in the 1990s, in response to scientific ideas from the 70s and 80s, just don't seem to fit the stuff that we're seeing now. So it's an interesting lesson for us as philosophers of science that you can't go on discussing the same 3 or 4 examples that some philosopher pulled out of the scientific literature and started discussing 30 years ago, because the science is changing. Maybe our philosophical framework can get out of date with respect to the science.
Yeah, that was very helpful. And we have some questions in the Zoom, but I want to ask another question before. I just forgot. So maybe their question first. Sorry. So there's Zhou Yufen has a not so related question, but maybe Paul, you can just give a short answer.
No. Oh, sorry. We have energy saving lights in the university now, so I'm just going to wave my arms to switch them on again.
Okay.
There you go. So, in order to combat climate change, I have to be plunged into darkness every 30 seconds. It's terrible. So that question, it's not about innateness at all. As you know, I'm a big critic of the idea of innateness. Again, this is a paper I'm in the middle of writing, so maybe internal and external constraints isn't exactly the right language. I was discussing this paper with an evolutionary biologist, Guillaume Dulcier, and he pointed out that there were 2 very different kinds of constraints in the models that I was talking about. And he's right. And so I've tried to come up with names for them, but these might not be good names to call them internal and external. So what I'm calling internal constraints are the constraints on the constraints created by the fact that the organism has to address many different adaptive problems using the same phenotype, namely its diet. So the organism chooses what to eat, but choosing what to eat is going to be important for its reproductive fitness, for its immune health, for its lifespan. And these are all things that are good for the organism. So in formal terms, what we have is a multiple objective optimization problem. Okay, so the organism has a whole series of numbers which it has to optimize, but they trade off against one another. And it's only got one control variable, which is what does it eat? Okay, and when it changes its diet, it moves all of those numbers. And so the internal constraints are the constraints created by the way that the whole body of the organism hangs together as a system. But the external constraints are, in this case, are of all the, because we're talking about behavior here, what kind, I mean, when again, in the older literature on adaptation, it's always assumed that the constraints on the organism are to do with genetics and development. So the organism can't adopt all possible phenotypes because it's not able to build them or make them. But in fact, in the models I'm looking at, the main thing that constrains what phenotype the organism can adopt is actually the environment. So if the phenotype is a diet, it's what food I eat, then the main constraint on that is nothing to do with my genetics and my developmental biology. It's what kinds of foods are there in the environment. So I can, if there are 20 different things I can eat, and each of those things contains a different combination of protein, fat, and carbohydrate, I can combine those foods in any possible combination. But in the nutrient space, that's going to mean there are some regions of nutrient space that I can get to, and other regions of nutrient space that I can't get to. So what phenotype I can have, what I eat, is constrained by the nutritional structure of the environment, by what's in the available foods. Okay, So again, that's something very different. It's not the same set of constraints as the constraints produced by the organism hanging together as a physiological system. Okay, and in fact, it's a kind of constraint that doesn't show up in the older literature on adaptationism. There's a lot of stuff in that literature about the organism can't have this phenotype because of its genetic architecture or its developmental biology. But there's very little about the organism can't have this phenotype because the environment won't let it. And once you start also thinking about environmental constraints like that, you realize that competition, so interspecific competition, becomes actually a constraint on biological form. There are phenotypes I can't evolve because other organisms are. So for example, if there's an organism that's eating all the high protein foods in my environment, I can't adopt a high protein diet. I can't adopt a high protein diet because whenever I try to go to a high protein food source, the other organism has eaten it first. Okay, so these are things that nobody thinks about in the philosophical literature on adaptation. So it's again an example of the whole discussion of constraints is, it's as if we, if you only think about a limited range of examples, you won't have a sort of balanced overall picture. And so I think a lot of the earlier literature is kind of, it's quite useful for thinking about how evolutionary biology changed as a result of the introduction of evolutionary developmental biology, or EVO-DEVO. So I think some of the older literature is quite useful when you look at the kinds of models that are built by evolutionary developmental biologists. But actually, Gould and Lewontin were fundamentally targeting the discipline of behavioral ecology. I mean, the people that they were attacking in that paper were behavioral ecologists. And when you look at the people that that are the successors, they might not call themselves behavioral ecologists, but they are literally, working in the tradition. They're the students of the students of the students of those guys, right? They're building the kind of models that I'm talking about today. And so, it's kind of interesting that, we read Gould and Lewontin, we create a philosophical framework. That philosophical framework has been quite useful for thinking about evolutionary developmental biology, but it's not useful for thinking about these people who work on the adaptive evolution of behavior, which is what Gould and Lewontin were meant to be talking about in the first place. So it's adaptationism is a big and complicated topic. I mean, I'm not claiming to have, to have sorted it all out. Yeah, but. Yeah.
So, Gu Jing, do you want to say more, or do you want to say hi to Paul? Because Gu Jing was in the summer school too, maybe.
All those years ago, right?
Yeah, maybe not, but I just remember my question. So I was when I was teaching philosophy of biology for students, I always puzzled or vexed by the metaphor of agential thinking, like Okasha says, was like there's a designer or an engineer there to design what the trait should be. And your distinction between adaptation as engineering and the adaptation as evolution seems to, or I just want to know if you want to get rid of the metaphor, or because as you said, evolutionary adaptationism also search for the optima in the model. So is there some place for the metaphor to remain, or just to get rid of the whole?
I think that's such a complicated question. So I'm going to tell you about two recent sort of, Samir Okasha, who is the guy whose book on agential thinking you're talking about. Samir is one of the invited commentaries on the paper that I read yesterday. And in Samir's commentary, he tries to show very cleverly, because he's a clever guy, he tries to show that in dynamic models of evolution, you can always make sense of the problem that the organism is trying to solve at a point in time. So Samir is trying to keep alive the idea of the function of the trait, but he's got a much more dynamic way of thinking about what functions are. So Samir, I think, is trying precisely to show that thinking about the goal of the organism, what is it trying to achieve, is still useful when you have a very dynamic conception of the evolutionary process. So I think that is I mean, to be honest, I will only be able to answer your question after I've written my reply to Samir's commentary. I think that's a really interesting and tough question, and I'm actively thinking about what to say about that. The other thing is something that Peter Godfrey Smith said many years ago, and which I found I learned a lot from. He pointed out that over the long history of evolutionary theory, from Darwin to now, there's been a big change from, he argues, I think very convincingly, that Darwin very much thought about adaptation in the engineering mode. And we can see that by how puzzled Darwin is by sexual selection. So Darwin writes as if sexual selection is a different process and some kind of a puzzle for his original theory of natural selection. He can't understand, given what a bad design the peacock's tail is. It's such a bad design. How can it exist? Well, there's this other process called sexual selection, which explains bad design. Whereas a modern Darwinist will just look at sexual selection as it's just natural selection. What's your problem? Everybody's maximizing their fitness, right?
Yeah.
And so what Peter Godfrey Smith pointed out was that over the long history of evolutionary theory, biologists have increasingly been happy to redefine adaptation as whatever natural selection produces. Instead of starting out with adaptation as something that you understand before understanding natural selection and saying, we can see what the adaptations are, they're the well-designed, well-engineered phenotypes. Now we try and explain that with natural selection. Instead, biology has progressively moved much closer to the idea that what we mean by adaptation is whatever natural selection produces. If it wins in natural selection, it's an adaptation. And so part of what I'm trying to do here is to say, if you consistently commit to that second way of thinking, then the classic philosophical literature on adaptationism doesn't make sense anymore. This is partly related to my somewhat confused answer to Ming Jun, but the adaptationism debate really was framed only if you still hang on to that engineering conception of adaptation. If you completely let go of that, then the debate goes away. Okay, so yeah, good question. It's and these are topics, as you know, I'm in the middle of writing this paper, so these are the things I'm trying to get straight for myself. So I can't get them entirely straight for you. It's all still balls up in the air, right? Juggling.
We have another question from Zhou Liqian. Liqian Ge.
Hi, thank you for the excellent lecture. And I think you have already partially answered my question, because, you know, this dynamic game series of biology or evolution have driven or motivated by the optimal notions. So when I think of this, it's almost like this engineering adaptationism. So if your argument is solid, then we should all rethink of those dynamic game theories, which we think is very helpful for us to understand the adaptation and evolution. Yeah.
So again, this really is where this forthcoming paper by Akasha is looking at. It's trying to, it's utilizing the idea of optimality as the best response at an instant. Yeah. So if optimality is best response, then we're very much in the world of evolution as a dynamic process. So I haven't written my reply to Akasha yet, but what I guess I'm going to say is that that is a completely coherent way of thinking, but that it's not, it's to regard that as the same thing as the organism being well designed in the engineering sense is a mistake. It's just a different idea.
Yeah, I agree. Yeah. Thank you.
Okay.
Oh, no.
We have a question in the room.
Thank you, Professor.
Can you speak?
Yes, I can hear.
Well, it seems that my question is not really a question, but an argument. And it seems that your presentation makes me think of an easier way to reformulate your thing. I will try to get this in a few words. It seems that your presentation tries to remind us of adaptation must goes with the constraints and trying to kill the notion of engineering adaptationism. But to some extent, that the adaptation or the notion of optimization is linked to the notion or the concept of constraint. For example, when we are trying to ask what is the max number of something, which we must presuppose that this something must have a constraint on it. We cannot try to ask this question with a blank over here. There is a max number of this function or this set, then there is no max number of something. So this is I'm trying to give an easier explanation of your argument. And I'm trying to express it with my poor English. Could you accept it?
Yeah. So I think what you're saying sounds to me very much like the point that John Maynard Smith made all those years ago, which is that it makes no sense to talk about an optimization problem without constraints.
Yes.
An optimization problem necessarily has constraints. So I think everybody accepted that point, but authors like Orzak and Sober, who are, of course, very eminent in this field, they nevertheless seem to think that there was some distinction to be drawn between the constraints that you had to have and the constraints which were competing with the optimality modeling exercise. So they sort of accept Maynard Smith's point that you have to have some constraints just to define a model, but they wanted to sort of draw a distinction between the constraints that are part of optimality modeling and constraints that compete with optimality modeling. Okay, and I guess perhaps the simplest way of making my point is that I don't accept that that distinction can be drawn, at least for the sorts of evolutionary models that I'm talking about. So maybe in some evolutionary models, you can cut the constraints into two kinds, the essential ones that are okay, and the ones that if you use them, it's diminishing the power of your optimality model. But for the models that I'm talking about, I don't think you can make such a distinction. So that the constraints are not, well, again, as I've said repeatedly, and I perhaps need to, I will be trying to make this clearer as I finish the paper. When you take the constraints away, you don't get a simplified version of the same model. You just get a different model. And if you take too many constraints away, you have no model at all. Yeah. Whereas in some of the examples that Orzak and Sober work with, it seems to make sense to say, when I take this constraint away, it's a simpler version of the same model. It's the same adaptive problem, but looked at more simply. Whereas in the models that I'm looking at, you just seem to be changing the question when you take the constraints away. Yeah. So I think what you say is true, but there's more to the question of the relationship between optimality and constraints. And perhaps, yeah, lots more philosophical work to do in sorting this out. And after all, I mean, a kind of meta philosophical question point. Why should all models be the same from the point of view of philosophy of science, right? Models are very diverse things. So yeah, we shouldn't be surprised if certain philosophical views work for one set of models, but not for another set of models. That would not be surprising. I'm going to turn my lights on again now. There.
Have any follow-up?
Well, thank you. I'm trying to give some more remarks that I totally accept what you have said previously, but I think it is better not to make this notion to be known by biologists, since the constraints or the type of constraints may contain biological truths. And I will try to give an explanation. For example, one of the most important enzymes in the Calvin cycle, RUBP carboxylase, have a bifunction while it will synthesize CO2 on RUBP and make it to 2 C5 something. And another function when when an oxygen goes into this enzyme, which will make RUBP to become a C4 and then broken down to which make we have the word photo respiration.
Okay.
It seems that the constraints is on this enzyme, which makes this enzyme trying to deal with something that it shouldn't do. This is kind of constraint. And another constraint that you mentioned in the presentation, since one cannot eat any, the optimized, the truly optimized diet, since we have to balance our reproducing energy and growing up energy. These are, it seems that there are truly kinds of constraints. So there should be some biological truths to separate those constraints. So that is why I'm trying to make your precious argument to make the biologists not hear them.
That's a very funny remark.
Is a student who's majored in biology and philosophy, double majored, and now he's a graduate student in philosophy of science section. So he's very familiar with biological cases, and
well, I think the best philosophy of science is always driven by close attention to particular examples.
So I think his question would be, since you do not make any distinctions between two different kinds of constraints, but he thinks in real cases there are real distinctions between different kinds of constraints, or the further question would be if you would admit some kind of constraints or certain amount of constraints which is true or by the traditional argument when they are saying about the constraints that can be removed.
Yeah, that's interesting. So I talked a bit earlier about how some of these ideas have been important in philosophical work on evolutionary developmental biology. And there you're thinking about macroevolution and the evolution of form. A lot of the constraints are meant to be coming from the sort of chemistry and physics of how bodies are built. And that's a very different area of biology from the optimization of behavior in relation to richly specified environments, which is the kind of thing that the models I've been talking about deal with. And I'm certainly very, very open to the idea that what we mean by constraints, that there are different kinds of constraints in different classes of biological models, and that the distinctions you might need to distinguish. So I think one of the interesting things about the cases that I'm examining in this paper is that they have got me thinking about the environment as a source of constraints. And that's an idea that I think is quite relatively new in the philosophical literature. But it may be an idea that's not very relevant to say, a model of the macroevolutionary design of developmental mechanisms, which is the kind of thing that people work on in Eva. So I certainly don't want to deny that there are many different kinds of constraints, and that those different kinds of constraints play different roles in evolutionary models. That would be that's obviously true. So I don't want to deny it. Yeah. Okay.
Do we have another?
I can follow up Zoran's topics about the two kinds of constraints distinction, because I know that Amundsen in 1994, he put up with the two kinds of constraints, formal constraints and the adaptive constraint. But I agree with you that this kind of the modeling is kind of I don't know, maybe fiction or imaginary. I'm not sure. And I wonder if there's some different kinds of levels of adaptationism that should be taken into consider. And my second question is that how can we ensure that the accuracy of this model of adaptationism, which when the traits we are interested in and incorporated into the evolutionary adaptationism framework of kind of the explanatory story during the modeling process. And I think that maybe it will prone to conclude from this kind of evolutionary adaptationism that it is kind of a fiction or just a storytelling in the history of evolution. Thank you.
Okay, two different things there. So I think that Amundsen paper is a very useful paper, and I tried to write a paragraph in the paper I'm currently writing to apply Amundsen's distinction between constraints on form and constraints on adaptation. And I couldn't really make sense of it for the models that I was looking at, whereas it makes a lot of sense in the cases that Amundsen describes. So again, I think different definitions of constraint may be useful for looking at one class of biological models, but not at another. So Amundsen, of course, again, is thinking about the evolution of morphology and also about macroevolution. So for the second part of your question, the idea of just so stories, it was predicated on if you go back and look at the models that Gould and Lewontin were criticizing, they were early models in behavioral ecology, and they're been quite important in the history of building, models of the evolution of behavior. But they were quite general and abstract models. So yesterday, for example, I was talking about the hawk-dove game. I mean, that's a model that was first proposed in the 1980s, late 70s, early 80s. And what people tended to do in the early days was to construct a model and try and get robust generic predictions out of the model, to say, here's a very general phenomena in evolution, and here are some general predictions. And now let's go and find in the living world examples of these interesting phenomena that we've built through our models, okay? Now, the idea was that modeling tradition would create kind of generic, robust predictions that we could then test by looking at real organisms. Whereas the models that I'm looking at are developed in a much more empirical and a much more iterative way. So you collect a bunch of data on what the organism is doing, and you build a model, and you use the model to make some predictions. You then go and check. So there's much more of a multi-stage process of examining the organism, building a model inspired by what you observe, and then testing the model by going and getting more data from the organism. So it's a multi-stage iterative process, very different from the way in which model building worked in behavioral ecology back in the 70s and 80s. And I think if that's the way that you're building your model, then so you can do in the same piece of work. My colleague David, the guy who the scientist I'm writing this paper with, in the same project, he might build a model, predict what the organism will do, and then go and look. And then he might have another study at the same time with a different bunch of mice, where they're watching what the mice do and then putting that data into the model. Okay, so they might be doing two studies. One study predicts the theoretical optimum and checks it against the mouse. The other study sees what the mouse actually does and then tries to build a model that will adequately predict that. And the two studies are being fed into the same bit of model building. Okay, so I think the thing about telling just so stories, really, again, it fits the science that Gould and Lewontin were writing about, which is not very data rich, and it's often based on observational studies of humans. So, I mean, for example, the kind of examples of adaptive storytelling that Gould criticized would often observe what a monkey is doing and then try and explain how the monkeys. I remember that people were very critical about some sociobiological studies of monkeys committing infanticide. Somebody had observed the monkeys committing infanticide, built an evolutionary model, and then Gould would say, it's just a just so story. You haven't tested your model, you've just observed the behavior and built a model to fit it. Whereas my colleague David has dozens of people following the monkeys around in the forest, collecting every time they poop and doing chemical analysis of the poop, okay? And then testing the model against that, and then making a prediction and going back into the field. So I think, again, some of the criticisms of Gould and Lewontin are best understood as specific criticisms of particular models that they were seeing in the 70s and 80s. And it's a mistake to think that those criticisms of the model are philosophically very interesting. I mean, many of those criticisms, my response is, okay, that wasn't a very rigorous piece of science, but it doesn't follow that you can't do it better. So I think the just so story criticism is looking quite out of date when you look at what I would say are, really careful and rigorous attempts to do behavioral ecology these days. But that's, yeah, so I think the Gould and Lewontin paper is a very rich and interesting paper, but it was specifically written for sort of political reasons to reject the application of certain kinds of science to human behavior. And so it's very much a paper that has to be read at its historical moment and in this kind of social and political context. And so it's a mistake to think that I've read a couple of philosophical papers where people try to worry they're reading Gould and Lewontin as if they were reading Hegel. You know, what does every sentence mean? We must extract the exact meaning, right? And I think the paper doesn't merit being read like that. It should be read as a, you know, more like somebody's letter or some, you know, at a unique historical time. And the ideas in it may not make much sense when science has moved on by 20 or 30 years. So that.
Yeah, so Junjie is our PhD student who's working on philosophy of medicine, and his interest is model organisms.
One of the other many different things that biologists mean by the word model. Yes.
Yes. We have a comment from Mingjun. Mingjun, could you speak up?
Oh, this is more like a complaint as a philosopher of biology. Like when I read all the literatures about like adaptationism, I feel that like people like coined a lot of terms like to solve their philosophical discussions, but in most cases those terms are kind of oversimplifying what scientists are doing, and as a result, in many cases, like those isms have more to do with creating a lot of like philosophical or conceptual topics and papers than to do with solving real problems. Like in many cases, we can agree about the facts, but we do not agree with about what kind of isms those facts can be used to support. Like what counts as adaptationism? Like you have thousands of ways to define it. Like many philosophers like have very subtle differences, but what is the real kind of contribution of those philosophical discussions to our understanding of the world, or our understanding of how biology actually works? Like it's more like a complaint. Sorry.
Yeah, but I think I'm very fond of the idea that in philosophy of science, we're actually building models of science. And it's always important not to confuse your model with the real world, right? A model is a tool for understanding the complex real world. And so, exactly. So again, when I was saying earlier that it's not so much that I say that Godfrey Smith's definitions are wrong, it's just that they're not useful definitions for thinking about the science I want to think about. So that's the same kind of criticism you might make of a biological model. There's nothing wrong with your model, but it's not applicable to the system I'm interested in. It might be, there's nothing wrong with the maths, it might be a perfectly good model, or it might be too abstract for what I want to do, or whatever it is, right? So I think we have to be very, I think what I would take from your comment is that we should always remember that the frameworks that we create in philosophy of biology are themselves models. And sometimes they need to be changed, and sometimes they need to be, you know, they're not useful for a new problem, and we need to create a new model. So yeah, let's not be too in love with our isms. Yeah. The other thing is the advice that the philosopher James Griesemer once gave me that I pass on to all of my students, which is never use the examples you found in the other philosopher. Always go back to the scientific literature and find a new example, because every time you change the example, you discover that things are actually more complicated than they seemed, right? So if you only get your examples from the ones you read in other philosophers, you'll miss so much of what's going on in the science. So you always, Jim Griesemer used to say that in philosophy of biology, you mustn't eat the dead animals you find by the side of the road, you have to kill your own, right? It's kind of like that with science.
Yeah, I can see some positive side from Mingjun's negative comments, because it is philosophers' work to define or distinguish some concepts. There's nothing wrong with that, but what current philosophers of science should do is to recognize what current scientists they are doing and what new things come out, and to follow up with scientists' footsteps, rather than to just mess up with those concepts. But if we do this, then it means we have more things to do than before. So it's rather positive. And related to this comment, I have a maybe final question. Back to yesterday, I have a comment personally from another people. He's saying that, so is it right to understand your project as within distraction of naturalism? So it seems that you are not like defend for a naturalist, but you are criticizing some work that some philosophers, naturalistic philosophers who want to naturalize some purpose and normativity. And if you succeed, then does it mean that this whole project, it would be a disaster to this project?
That's a good question. So I guess what I think is that naturalizing normativity is one of the great philosophical problems. It's a really big philosophical problem. It's not just a philosophy of science problem. It's a real, kind of great problem in philosophy. How do we fit the normative into the scientific worldview? And I think that whatever your view on whether you're a hardline naturalist, or you're an anti-naturalist, or you're one of these liberal naturalists that's trying to make a compromise between them, like John McDowell, for example, whatever your view is, the notion of selected effect function has made a lot of people think that problems have been solved before they've been really solved. And since we're all intellectually honest, whatever we want the answer to be, we don't want a bad early answer instead of the right answer. Okay, so I mean, I guess my view is what I'm trying to do is to shake up what I think is a complacent idea that this is obviously going to work and it's going to work everywhere, instead of it's not clear whether it works, and if it does work, it may only work in some cases. And I think to show that it could do all the work that people have said it can do, we're not even close to succeeding in that, and we need to acknowledge that. Yeah, I think it's a brave option. Very brave, courageous. Well, after all, it's funny. I mean, I wrote one of the most, that 93 paper of mine is still one of the most highly cited papers defending the theory. And so, you've got to be able to admit you're wrong, right? Or at least that you were too quick. So there you go. Yeah.
Okay, so I think we are, that's for today's talk and two lectures in a series. And we are very thank you both, because I have learned a lot and think more about, in general, about what philosophers of science and philosophers of biology should do, and what thinking more meta-philosophically about the change, dynamical change of one topic to in progress. How do we make some progress in some philosophical topics? So thank you very much. And it's time to say goodbye. Maybe next time we can.
Well, thank you for the extremely intelligent and stimulating questions. And especially for today's paper, I will learn a lot from this discussion time, and you'll hear me give a better version in Pittsburgh in November if you are at the Philosophy of Science Association. Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you. Bye-bye.